Are you looking for one simple opening idea you can use as black against literally anything white does in the first few moves? And more importantly, are you looking to shock and destroy your opponents as black in the first few moves of the game using some absolutely insane tricks, traps, and ideas? If you answered yes to either of those questions, this is the video for you. In this video, I'm going to show you how to use the Nimzowitch Opening, aka one knight to c6, against literally anything white does in the opening. That includes one e4, one d4, one c4, one knight f3, and so on. I'm covering literally everything for you guys to show you that one knight c6 is the only opening you need as black to absolutely destroy white no matter what he does. Now, the idea behind this, against anything white does, we are going knight to c6, and the main follow-up is going to be either d5 or e5, although there are some lines where we may want to go d6 or e6 instead. Don't worry, I'm going to cover all of this. Now, of course, 1e4 is the most popular opening move for white. Bobby Fischer did say it is best by test. So let's start with 1e4. In response to 1e4, we of course are going to go one knight c6 as we do against any first move. Now, very often, white is going to go d4. Now, this position can be achieved after 1 e4, then d4. It can also be achieved after 1 d4 and then 2 e4. So either way, white is getting his two pawns in the center of the board, trying to establish central dominance. But little does he know, this is exactly what we want white to do, because here we have two different ideas to counterattack in the center immediately. The first one is going to be e5, and the second one is going to be d5. Let's start with the move e5. This move is a lot of fun to play, and there's a trap right out of the opening in this line. All right, here, if white wants to fight for an advantage, he pretty much has to go d5. Now, you don't have to do that. You can go, say, I don't know, knight to f3, at which point we basically have a Scotch opening on the board. Of course, there are a lot of lines here. Black can simply take on d4, white takes back, then you go knight f6, and so on, and black's got a really good game. Don't worry, I'll give an overview of this at the very end. Beyond that, after e5, if white takes on e5, d takes e5, then you can just recapture with the knight. Knight takes e5, and again, you're doing absolutely just fine. Don't worry, I'll show all of these lines at the end as well. But the main move here for white is going to be e5. This is the one you will likely see in your game. So we're striking in the center, and then white says, you know what, I'm going to gain space myself and have these pawns on e4 and d5. Now, of course, your knight on c6 is under attack. It has to go somewhere, and the best square is e7. Now, this is the real starting point of this line. What is black's idea? This knight on e7 is not going to stay there forever. Instead, it's heading over to the g6 square, where it will be eyeing f4. The other knight's going to go to f6. The bishop's going to go to c5, and black's going to have a great setup again with knight g6, knight f6, bishop c5, likely short castles, and so on. And later in the game, you can even go, say, c6, counterattacking against white's strong pawn on d5. That is the main idea. Now here, white has several different good moves that he can choose from. For example, knight f3 and knight c3 are very playable. h4 is a cheeky idea we're going to cover. Bishop d3 can also be played, but let's start with the move c4. This move is extremely common. You're very likely to see it in your own games, and white is just bolstering his pawn center. He sort of has a King's Indian style pawn structure in the center of the board. Now here, as black, as usual, we are going to go knight g6. You swing out the knight frees at the bishop. Now bishop c5 is an idea, and of course the knight on g6, it does eye the f4 square, and if you can get a knight into f4 without it being captured, that would be extremely strong for you as black. Now here, white, what are his options? What can he do in this position? Well, one idea is going to be bishop d3. You develop your bishop, bolster e4 and c4 and so on. It looks very logical, but if you see this as black, you should be foaming at the mouth, because there are so many lines here where white can be losing out of the opening. We're going to continue. Bishop c5, our standard move. White can go, say, knight c3. We'll go knight f6, developing. And here, The most common move for white in this position, by far, is going to be knight g to e2. White thinks with his knights on e2 and c3, he's got a very good position, but little does he know, this move, knight to e2, already on move 7, the most popular move here for white in this position, it's already losing. Here, as black, we're going to go knight g4. That is one of the benefits of this knight on the f6 square. It is eyeing g4, and now look at this. The knight eyeing f2, the bishop also honing in on that. Black is threatening bishop takes f7 or knight takes f7. Either of those would be absolutely devastating. I mean, what is white going to do? If you go h3, trying to drive back that knight, that is a mistake. Knight takes f2, wins the pawn, threatens the rook. The rook's got to move to say f1. But I mean, look at this position. You can capture on d3 and so on. You're just absolutely crushing white after a mistake like h3. Now, what else can white do? Well, I can also go rook f1 trying to defend, but this move is just as ugly as it gets. I mean, for example, you can take on h2 and so on. Black has so many different ways, and you are threatening the rook on f1 once again. Now, the most common move here, or the one that you are most likely to face as black in the opening, is going to be short castles. White defends the pawn on f2 with the king and the rook. However, he's already losing here because one of the other ideas of knight g4 is that it frees up this diagonal for the queen. And here, queen to h4 is a good move. We're increasing the pressure on f2, but more importantly, we're threatening checkmate in one move. If white does not respect the threat, let's say he goes g3, trying to chase back that queen, you may actually face this in your own games. It's mate in one. Queen takes h2. Already, it's move 9, and we have checkmated white as black using one knight c6, the only opening you need. Now, what else can white do in this position? I mean, honestly, there's not a whole lot. Let's say you go h3. The point being, you're blocking the h2 square. Queen takes h2 is not a possibility now. Well, here in this position, you just trade on f2. Knight takes f2. The knight is defended by the queen and the bishop. It's very hard to take it. And if you don't take it, black's threatening knight takes d1 with the discovered attack on the king on the g1 square. This is already really, really bad. Now, the best move here for white is going to be rook takes f2, giving up the rook for that knight. You recapture with the queen. The king has to go back. And then you can just go d6. And look at this. It is total domination. You're up a pawn, you're up the exchange, that being you have the extra rook versus the extra minor piece of white. That is a huge advantage. The bishop's opened up. You can always go say bishop d7, long castles, and so on, and you are crushing. And that's only if white plays the best move. Let's say instead of rook takes f2, that is the best move here. Let's say instead he goes, say, queen c2, a very common idea at the beginner level, getting the queen out of the attack. Well, here, black has the discovered attack on the king. You can actually go knight takes h3, and look at this. Both the knight and the bishop are teaming up on that king on the g2 square. The king has to move. Whenever you have a double attack in chess, you can't capture both pieces at the same time. Therefore, you do have to move the king. So let's say king to h1, and here, all you have to do is move the knight out of the way. Say knight g5 is perfectly playable, and look at this. The queen covers the h-file. The bishop covers the g1 square, and the king is getting checkmated once again. It's move 11, and again, we have checkmated white out of the opening. So, as we can see, when white goes for that c4 idea, followed by bishop d3, followed by knight e2, I mean, he's going to be in so much trouble immediately. So what else can white do after, say, c4? After c4, then knight g6, white also has the idea of, say, bishop e3, going for very fast development of the queen side. Maybe he wants to go bishop e3, queen d2, knight c3, getting sort of an English attack setup with maybe f3, h4, g4, and so on. That's another aggressive idea by white, but that does not mean it's very good. Here, black has plenty of ideas. The move I'm recommending for you in response to bishop e3 is going to be bishop to b4. You hit the king immediately, and of course, with that pawn on the c4 square, it can't go backwards to c3 to block the attack. Now, what should white do? Knight d2 is a very common response. It's the strongest line according to the computer, but here black can continue. Knight f6, pressuring the pawn on e4. Look at this. That knight is pinned. Now you are literally threatening knight takes e4, as again, that knight is pinned to the king on e1. Let's say white goes bishop d3, trying to defend. Fair enough. We can go queen e7. We don't even have to castle yet. Instead, queen e7 maintains the option of potentially castling long on the queen side if we need it. Now here, for example, if white plays the strongest move, g3, we can just go bishop c5, retreating our bishop. It did its job on b4, offering the bishop trade, and after, say, bishop takes, then queen takes c5, we're doing just fine as black. We're even maybe close to being equal right out of the opening. Now, instead, let's say white goes for a weaker move like knight to f3. How do we punish this move? Here, black can actually go knight g4, trying to win the bishop pair, threatening knight takes e3, and look at this. Where is that bishop going to go? If you try to keep it alive, the only square is going to be g5. Bishop g5 looks logical until you see black can just go f6. The good old-fashioned Ben Feingold counterattack as black. You drive back that bishop. Then you can simply trade on e3 right away, or you can wait a little bit. For example, castles, if white goes a3, then you trade on e3, forcing f takes e3, and then you retreat your bishop, bishop c5. And now look at this. White's pawn structure in the center of the board is just atrocious. Black is doing excellent. I mean, he's got a huge advantage here. He's even threatening bishop takes e3. White's gonna have to waste another tempo trying to defend that, say queen e2. Then you can go a5, clamping down on any sort of b4 advance, and you're just dominating as black. So let's go back here. Overall, the move c4, not exactly very good from white's perspective. When you go c4, trying to bolster your center, it just leads to massive problems for white. Instead of that, let's say white goes for the move knight to f3. That move makes a little more sense. You do develop the king side, setting up potentially bishop d3, short castles, but also maybe h4, h5 ideas. More on that in just a second. Well, here, if white goes knight f3, as usual, we are going to go knight g6. The point being, we're ready for our plan, knight f6, bishop c5, and short castles. That is one of the main plans in the Nimzowitsch opening. Now, if white ever goes for a fast h4 advance, threatening h5, trying to drive back that knight, all you have to do is going to be h5 as black, and here you're doing just fine. Here's a sample line. White may go knight c3. We go knight f6. If white goes bishop g5, we can't go h6, driving it back, but we can just go bishop c5, again, following our plan. Now here, if white takes on f6, that's going to be a huge mistake as we just recapture, we have the bishop pair, and we're doing just fine. Instead of that, if white goes, say, I don't know, knight d2, intending knight b3, it's an interesting idea, but again, black's doing just fine. You know, we can go a6, giving our bishop that retreat square on a2 or a7, and we can even go bishop b4 later, pressuring that knight on c3. Either way, black is doing just fine. That means the early h4 advance from white after knight f3 is nothing to be afraid of. Let's say white goes bishop d3, intending a fast short castles. Again, nothing to be concerned about. We go knight f6, short castles, then bishop c5, and black already on move 6 is equal out of the opening. Now, what else can white do? Let's say white goes for fast queenside development. Let's say knight c3, intending a fast bishop g5. That's another dangerous idea. Black can go knight f6, and after bishop g5, all we have to do is just h6. Put the question to the bishop. Obviously, if you go back to h4, our knight on g6 guards that square. White would lose the bishop, but beyond that, if you trade, you lose the bishop. And if you go back, this move bishop g5 doesn't make a whole lot of sense from white's perspective. So, for example, let's say white trades on f6. Bishop takes. We just recapture with the queen, no problem. We're still intending bishop c5, followed by a short castling, and black's doing just fine. For example, bishop d3, bishop c5, castles, d6. Black is doing excellent. And from here, we are ready for ideas like knight to f4. Now, let's say white goes a3. This move is very common. You're setting up the b2, b4 advance. Here, as black, we can jump in with our knight to f4, and white was the one who thought he would be attacking out of the opening against our Nimzowitsch opening. He went for the fast d5 advance, driving back our knight, but the hunter has become the hunted because we are about to unleash a crazy tactical idea against white in this position. So, let's say white goes b4. Chasing the bishop. That is the idea behind a3 after all. You may be thinking, all right, in this position, surely bishop b6 is forced, right? Well, you thought wrong. In this position, black has the unbelievable idea, bishop to h3. Now, what is the idea behind this move? Well, the idea is you are threatening bishop takes g2 or knight takes g2, and even the idea of queen g6, threatening checkmate on g2 once again does come to mind. So black has a lot of traps here. Now, the obvious question, can you take that bishop on h3? It turns out, no, you cannot. That is going to lead to a forced mate. If you get this position as black, I'm going to show you exactly how to punish white out of the opening. But first of all, the best move for white, believe it or not, is going to be g3. The point being, you are trying to defend that g2 square at all costs. You don't want to lose that pawn, but here black can just go bishop to b6, and he's doing outstanding. He's threatening the rook, he's threatening queen g6 ideas, and so on, and black has a crushing advantage here. Now, instead, let's say white is dumb enough to capture on h3. What is the idea here? We start queen g6. The king is under attack. The most obvious question is, what if you go king h1? Well, here, queen g2 is checkmate. Already on move, what is this? Move 13, we're already checkmating white out of the opening. Instead, let's say he goes for the move knight to g5, trying to defend. The point being, you are opening up this diagonal for the queen. Then you can take on g5. White's going to have to go queen g4, and here, you don't trade queens. If you trade queens, white's doing relatively okay after queen takes h takes. Instead, what you do is knight takes h3, winning that pawn on h3, and the queen can't take because the queen is pinned to the king. That is not an option. White has to go king h1. There's nothing else. Then you take the queen, queen takes g4, and white is still getting busted. For example, f3, trying to drive back the queen. Then we can go knight f2. What's the idea? If the rook takes, then we go queen h4, threatening the rook with the queen and the bishop. Then if white goes rook f to f1, then we go bishop e3, threatening bishop f4, and then queen takes h2 again would be checkmate. And in the meantime, we can always go castles f5, trying to bring our rooks into the game and so on. Again, black has a crushing attack, not to mention he's up an entire queen. I mean, what more could you ask for out of the opening? So, let's go way back to this position right here. Instead of bishop takes f6, again, if white does that after queen takes, we get that huge attack starting with bishop c5, knight f4, d6, bishop h3, and so on. Instead, what if white goes for the move, say, bishop h4? This is a huge mistake because here we take on h4, white takes back, and then we have another trap out of the opening. Here we can actually trade on e4. It's a very common idea in the open games after 1 e4, e5. Whenever you have that knight on h4, you can trade on e4. The point being, you open up the discovered attack on the knight on h4. If white takes, you take back on h4, you win back the pawn, or the piece, sorry, you're up a pawn, you're pressuring e4, you're threatening bishop c5, queen takes f2, and so on. I mean, the attack is just overwhelming. What else can white do after h6? Well, if you go back, bishop d2, I mean, that is just ugly. Black's going to go bishop c5, again, pressuring f2, threatening knight g4 ideas. And what is white supposed to do? I mean, this entire line, starting with move 5, knight c3, and then bishop g5, is just no good for white here. All right, we've seen knight f3 ideas. They're not very good. Real fast, let's go through the other alternatives that white can play. The move h4 immediately is very interesting. The point being, if you go knight g6, then white goes h5, driving back that knight. So this h4 move is playing against the idea of knight g6, but we don't have to do that. Instead, knight f6. And if white makes a move, say knight f3 or bishop d3, then we just go h5, clamping down on that square, followed by knight g6, bishop c5, and so on, and we're just fine. What else can white do? Honestly, those are the main options here, and black is doing just fine. So, overall, after e4 and then d4, black can go e5 and get a great game. Again, after d5, knight c to e7, intending knight g6, knight f6, bishop c5, and so on. But beyond that, there's actually a stronger move. The move d5 is the main idea for black here, and we're sort of reaching kind of a modified Caro-Kann style position. Of course, the Caro-Kann if white goes e5 here, that is the main idea. This is pretty similar to the advanced variation of the Caro-Kann. For example, in this position, let's go to this position right here. The only difference is that we have a pawn on c6 instead of the knight. So let's go back to our position after d5 and then e5. Again, if that pawn were on c6 instead of the knight, we would have a Caro-Kann. So if you like the Caro-Kann as black, this is going to be a good option as well. Now, after we go d5, what we want is we want white to go e5. That is the strongest move, but if he does that, I've got a whole bunch of ideas to show you, great ways to get counterplay against it. Now, what if white trades on d5 instead? E takes d5. Then we just recapture queen takes d5, and we've got an unbelievable version of a Scandinavian opening. So e takes d5 is no good. Here the queen and the knight are pressuring d4. If white tries to defend, say knight f3, then we fly out with the bishop g4, and here we're ready for long castles with the rook on the d1 square, pressuring d4 as well. This is just overwhelming. Here's a sample line. For example, knight c3, white attacks the queen. We go queen to h5. The queen stays active. We're threatening bishop takes, and then the queen takes, g takes, and then knight takes. So white has to do something about that threat. For example, if he goes d5, attacking the knight, we do not move the knight. No, that Nimzowitsch knight stays on c6. Instead, we castle long. And look at this. If you take on c6, bang, rook takes d1, wins the queen on the spot. He can't do that. Instead, white has to go bishop e2, trying to hang on, but then we go e5. The point being, you can't take the pawn en passant again as you lose the queen. And if you don't do anything, black is threatening ideas like potentially f5 then e4, or knight f6 then e4. Either way, again, pressuring that knight on f3. For example, short castles is a decent move for white. Then we can just go f5, a very strong move, threatening e4. And again, we've got a huge initiative with our king castles safely on the queen side. White's going to be in a lot of trouble. Now, instead of e takes d5, let's say white doesn't go e5. Let's say he defends it with, say, knight c3. That's a reasonable move, but black's going to get a great position all the same. We trade on e4, and here already, knight takes e4 looks very logical, but it's actually a huge mistake. If he trades on e4, knight takes e4, then we just go bang, queen takes d4, gobbling up that pawn. We're doing excellent. I mean, there's not much else white can do beyond the idea of e5 in this position, but if he does that, we've got a very simple plan. So let's look at the main line of this e4, d4, knight c6, d5, e5 line. What is black's idea here? Well, very similar to the Caro-Kann, black is going to go bishops f5, followed by potentially a very fast f6 advance, pressuring the pawn on e5. Of course, normally in the Caro-Kann, one idea is going to be a fast c5 advance, but that is not an option as that knight does block the pawn on c7. Therefore, f6 will be our main idea, usually with bishop f5 played first. All right, here. The main move for black is going to be bishop f5, but if you are a madman, if you really want to punish white immediately out of the opening, I do recommend the move f6. Now, we're going to cover both of these. f6 is a little more aggressive, and if white isn't careful, he can lose a lot faster. For example, here we are threatening f takes, then knight takes e5. If white ignores the threat, let's say he goes h3. Then we just trade on e5, and then trade back with a knight or up a pawn, and we're just dominating here. Now, after f6 instead, let's say white tries to defend with knight f3. Then we go bang, bishop g4, pinning the knight on f3, and our threat is bishop takes, and if queen takes, then knight takes d4. For example, h3, bishop takes, queen takes, knight takes d4, and we win a pawn with a crushing position. So what is white supposed to do after knight f3, then bishop g4? There's not a whole lot he can do. For example, if he goes bishop e2 trying to defend, we can trade on f3, bishop takes, then trade on e5. F takes e5, d takes, and then e6, bolstering d5 and threatening knight takes e5. That's a great plan. And from there, black can castle long. For example, bishop f4, queen d7, castles, and long castles. And again, we've got a very fun, very aggressive, very simple to understand attacking idea for black. Now, the strongest move back in this position for white is going to be bishop b5, the counter pin, pinning our knight on c6 to the king on the e8 square. But don't worry, black has a very simple way to deal with this. We trade on e5, f takes e5, then after d takes, we go for the move queen d7, blocking the pin. Now, yes, the queen is pinned instead of the king now, but it's not a permanent pin, and black still has a lot of ideas. For example, if white takes on c6, that would be a huge mistake. We just recapture, and after castles, we go e6, threatening bishop c5, and we can always long castles again with a great game. So, after f6, what is white supposed to do? You can't go h3, we trade there. If you go knight f3, then bishop g4 is really, really strong. You don't want to allow that. It's honestly hard to find a good idea for white in this position. Beyond that, you can go f4, trying to bolster the pawn on e5. It's a decent idea, but black then can just go bishop f5, resuming a plan we're going to see a little bit later in this video, and black is going to be doing just fine. Now, there are a lot of traps here. Here's one really cool trap you can use in your own games. Let's say white plays passively. Bishop e2. We go e6, and then c3. White's trying to bolster all his pawns on these dark squares. Then we have the insane move. It's a very common idea in the French defense opening. You can actually go for the move g5. The point being, it's a deflection pawn sacrifice. If white trades on g5, then we trade on e5, and after, say, d takes, then knight takes is very, very strong. And now the only problem with the g5 advance is we are loosening this diagonal. The king is exposed. If white goes bishop h5, then we just go bishop g6, and after bishop takes, h takes, and here the rook has the open line of attack on the h file. Black is doing more than fine. So overall, f6 immediately on move 3 is a pretty good move. Now, the computer does say bishop f5 immediately is a little bit stronger, so this will be my main recommendation. But if you want to shock your opponent immediately on move 3, f6, the bend fine go counterattack on move 3 can also be played. Now here, what is our main idea? The main idea is we want to go e6, then f6, again, counterattacking on e5, and from there, we can castle long, we can castle short with, say, bishop e7, knight h6, short castles. Black has a very flexible setup. Let's say white goes for the move knight f3, very common. In the advanced variation of the Caro-Kann, one of white's most common setups is knight f3, then bishop e2, then castles, and from there he'll figure out what he wants to do. Let's say white does that plan. Then we just go e6, and if bishop e2, then f6, counterattacking against e5. Now here, if white castles, we'll just trade some pieces. F takes, knight takes, d takes, and then we can just go knight e7, intending, say, knight c6, queen d7, and maybe even long castles. For example, bishop g5, queen d7, knight d2, and then long castles. And again, we've got a very easy to play, very fun, aggressive attacking setup as black. Now, what if white doesn't go knight f3 in this position in response to bishop f5? Well, the other big idea here for white is actually going to be c3. The point being, white wants to follow up f4, getting, again, that really, really impressive, visually striking pawn center in the middle of the board. Now, what should we do? Well, our plan is still mostly the same. Here we go e6 first. Then if f4 from white, then the key move is going to be, believe it or not, h5. The point being, we are clamping down on that g4 square. We're threatening ideas like knight h6 with the knight behind the pawn. Now, if white goes knight f3, we just go knight h6, and then here's a sample line. Bishop e2, bishop e7, castles, and here black even has the insane idea of knight to a5. The point being, we are trying to get our other pawn on c7 into the game. For example, knight d2, c5, and if white takes, we just recapture with the bishop. Bishop takes c5, hitting the king on g1, and we're doing just fine. So overall, as we can see, if white goes for the setup with, say, e4 and d4 straight out of the opening, let's go all the way back. e4, knight c6, d4, we can go d5, and if white goes for the strongest idea of e5, then bishop f5 or f6 are both very, very strong. And again, to review, you don't even have to do that. Instead, e5, intending d5, knight c d7, and then the other plan of knight g6, knight f6, bishop c5, and so on is also very, very strong. Now, what else can white do after e4, knight to c6? Well, d4 is the most logical move. It's the most aggressive, but white does have some other ideas. Let's say white goes, I don't know, knight f3. Now, in this position, as black, you have a choice. On the one hand, you have the option of going e5, transposing back to some sort of open game after 1 e4, e5. For example, e5, and then white can go, say, bishop c4, the Italian opening, bishop b5, the Roy Lopez, d4, the Scotch, and so on. But there is a lot of theory there, and if you want a simple, easy to understand line, I don't recommend e5. Instead, the easiest one here for black is going to be e6 in the spirit of the French defense. The point being, if white goes d4, then we go d5, and it's sort of a French defense, but black has gone knight c6, and white has gone knight f3. And this move, knight f3, is not a move you want to play early in the French defense. It's just not that strong. Now, what are white's options here? Well, first of all, you can trade on d5, but that just achieves an exchange variation after e takes, then e takes. And here, with the very symmetrical pawn structure, black's just going to go knight f6, bishop d6, short castles, and black is going to be just fine. So, if white wants to fight for an advantage, he can't trade on d5. What else can white do? Well, his options are e5, advancing the pawn, or knight c3, or knight d2, trying to defend. Let's say he goes e5, a logical idea. Then all we have to do here, as usual, is just f6, counterattacking on e5. For example, if white goes bishop d3, intending a fast short castles, then we trade on e5. F takes e5 is the move, and if white takes back, d takes e5, then we can actually go knight to h6, intending bishop e7 and short castles. And here, shockingly, if white trades on h6, bishop takes, that is nothing to worry about, believe it or not. For example, bishop takes, g takes, and here black is doing just fine. We can go bishop g7, intending bishop takes or knight takes e5, followed by short castles, and black has a great game. So this idea of bishop takes h6 is nothing to worry about in these openings. So instead of e5, white can also go knight c3 or knight d2, trying to defend the pawn on e4. Let's say he goes knight c3. Then black just goes knight f6, counterattacking that pawn. White's going to go e5. Usually, you retreat the knight back to the d7 square. Or sorry, you don't do that. Instead, what you can actually do here is the move knight to e4. Now, this move is so strong because if white trades on e4, knight takes e4, then you trade back with the pawn, and the pawn on d4 is exposed. For example, knight takes e4 is a massive mistake because then after d takes e4, the knight's under attack, and if you move the knight, say to d2, then bang, queen takes d4, wins a pawn. You're threatening the pawn on e5 as well, and black's going to get a huge advantage. Now, instead of knight c3, what if white goes knight d2, also defending e4? In that case, knight f6, all the same, in the spirit of the classical variation of the French defense. Now here, if white goes e5, in this position, we do have to go knight d7. If instead we go knight e4, then white can simply go c3, bolstering his pawn on d4, and he's doing just fine. So instead, knight d7 is going to be our move, but even here, black is doing just fine because of the idea of a fast f6 advance counterattacking on e5. For example, here's a sample computer line, knight b3, a5, threatening a4. White's going to go a5, locking down the queen side, and then the move bishop e7, bishop e2, and f6. Again, counterattacking in the center. If white trades, we recapture with the knight. And after knight takes f6, we are doing outstanding. There's nothing to worry about. That means overall, if white goes knight f3 after e4, then e6, intending d5 in the spirit of the French defense opening is actually super, super, super strong. Now, beyond that, if you like the Scandinavian opening as black, you can also go d5 here, intending e takes, queen takes, and black's doing relatively fine here. But of course, after knight c3, you do need a line in the Scandinavian, say queen d6, a5, d8, and so on are the main moves, but that line is a lot more complicated. There's a lot of theory here, so I do recommend instead the move e6 here as black. Now, that mostly covers 1 e4. After 1 e4, then knight c6, white is almost always going to go either d4 or knight f3. But what about other openings like 1d4. Let's cover that next. So if white opens 1d4, as usual, we are going to go 1 knight to c6, our Nimzowitsch opening. Now, what are white's ideas here? What can he do? First of all, e4 is an idea, but that immediately transposes back to 1 e4, as then again, black can go either d5 or e5, as I showed earlier, and black gets a great game no matter what. So after d4, then knight c6, what else can white do? Well, his two main ideas here are going to be, for example, d5, attacking the knight, but he can also go, say, knight f3, intending bishop f4 in the spirit of the London opening. So let's cover both of those ideas. Let's say white goes d5, attacking that knight on c6. Here, unfortunately, we do have to move our knight. We simply cannot lose it. So we're going to go knight e5. Now here, white normally goes e4, increasing his control of the center, bolstering his pawn on d5. And here, the key move for black is going to actually be the move e6, threatening e takes d5, trying to counterattack against white's very strong pawn center. Now, black is going to be relatively okay here. For example, if white goes f4, attacking that knight, then we can go knight g6, dropping back. If knight c3, knight f6, and here black is doing just fine. Even if white trades queens with, say, e takes d6, then e takes, queen takes, king takes, here black is doing just fine. There is just not that much to worry about. So overall, d5 is a good move, but if you know the idea of knight e5, intending e6, or even another idea, if white goes e4, instead of e6, you can also go knight g6 immediately. For example, if white goes c4, then we can go e5, and here we're right back to that other line we played earlier, where it's e4, d4, knight c6, e5, d5, knight cd7. And here our plan is the same, knight f6, bishop c5, and so on. So there's so many ways to play here as black, and even again, if white recaptures en passant and trades queens, we're going to be just fine. Black is essentially equal out of the opening on move 6. So d5 on move 2 looks scary, but it's actually not that bad. There's just not that much to worry about. Now, instead of d5, let's say white is a 1d4, c4 player as white. It's very common for white to go 1d4 and then 2c4 in the spirit of the Queen's Gambit opening. Let's say he does that here, c4. Then what do we do? Well, here again, black can go either d5 or e5. Both of these moves are excellent. For example, if black goes e5, then the idea again is e5, d5, knight cd7, e4, knight f6, intending knight g6, bishop c5, and so on. And again, black is fine. Beyond that, we could also go for the immediate move d5 in the spirit of the Scandinavian opening. And here black again is doing great. If white takes, we recapture with the queen, threatening the pawn on d4. And if white tries to defend with knight f3, then bang, bishop g4 attacks the piece, defending the pawn on d4. And black is getting a great game. So black has a lot of ways to deal with the idea of c4. Now, let's say white goes for a London opening setup with knight f3 and then bishop f4. I mean, that might be the most common opening setup from white, especially at the beginner level. So let's look at that. d4, knight c6, then knight to f3. What does black do here? Well, here black has a variety of options. You can go d5, heading to a Chigorin variation of the Queen's Gambit. Beyond that, knight f6 is playable. It's sort of a two knights tango. White can go d5, driving back your knight. But overall, that line is not nearly as fun. The line I am recommending to you is going to be actually d6. Now, this move is playing against the idea of an early bishop f4 from white. For example, if white goes for the move bishop f4, what we're going to do is an immediate bishop g4, staying very active. Keep in mind, our queen side is now almost completely developed, and if white goes e3, trying to defend his pawn on d4, that walks right into our trap. We are going to go e5, and we have a very good attacking setup. The point being, if white trades on e5, we trade back. And if white captures the queen, now we can recapture with the rook. Rook takes d8, and now look at this. All of our pieces are so active. The knight on f3 is being threatened. The bishop on f4 is being threatened. And for example, if white trades on e5, knight takes e5, that is a huge mistake. It opens up this diagonal for the bishop, and now rook d1 is literally going to be a checkmate on the spot in the spirit of the opera game featuring, was it Philidor in the opera game? Someone comment down below what game I'm thinking. I think it was the opera game with an early checkmate on, well, not game, it was white checkmating black, but you know what I'm saying. Anyways, point being, after rook takes, black gets a great game, knight takes e5, loses on the spot to rook d1 checkmate, and if white instead trades on e5 with the bishop, then again we recapture, and again if you trade on e5, then again we have that checkmate on the d1 square. So that is my recommendation. If white goes for the London setup with an early knight f3 and bishop f4, I like the idea of an early d6, bishop g4, and then e5, counterattacking, in the center and on the queen side. Now, that pretty much covers one d4. What else can white do? We've covered one e4 ideas. We've covered one d4 ideas. What about one c4? In that case, again, we can go knight c6, showing, again, this is the only opening you need. Now, what can white do here? If he goes, say, knight f3, then we can go e5, heading back to an English opening, and this is just fine for black. Black is doing excellent. Beyond that, you can go, say, d5 immediately. Maybe you want to go d6, heading bishop g7, and so on. Black has so many ideas here. Instead of that, if white goes, say, d4, we're back to a 1d4 opening, and if white goes e4, in this position, all you have to do as black is just e5, and now you have this huge hole on d4 for that knight. Black is doing outstanding here. Now, what about one knight f3? As usual, we are going to go knight c6, and here, white doesn't really have a good way to avoid the other lines. If you go e4, it's back to one e4 territory. If he goes d4, it's back to one d4 territory. If he goes c4, we're back to one c4 territory. Beyond that, let's say he goes, I don't know, e3 or d3 or something, then you can just go, say, e5 or d5, and black is getting a great game. Again, what else can white do? Let's say he goes one g3 out of the opening, then again, knight c6 is our move, and if bishop g2, then we can just go d5, intending a very fast e5, and then from there, I mean, you can do whatever you want as black. Black is doing just fine. So, as you can see, this really is the only opening you need as black if you know what you're doing, and I do want to recap everything real fast that we covered in this video. Here, I guess no matter what white does on move one, we are going knight c6. If he goes for a fast setup with e4 and then d4, we are ready for that. It's just what we want. We go knight c6, and if d4, here you have two main options, d5 and e5. d5 is technically the stronger move according to the engine. The idea being if e5, then we want to go bishop f5 or f6. Either way, black is doing great. Instead, the move e5 is also playable. If white goes d5, then we go knight c to e7, intending knight g6, bishop c5, knight f6, and if white ever goes h4, we just go h5, blocking that pawn, and we are doing great. Instead, if white goes e4, knight c6, then knight f3, here you can go e5, heading back to an open game, but my main recommendation is going to be e6, intending d5, with some sort of French defense setup. For example, d4, d5, and if white ever goes e5, of course, f6 is going to be our move. Now, d4 is also possible. Again, knight c6 is the idea. If white goes d5, then we go knight to e5, intending either a fast e6 or a fast knight g6, and only then e6. If white doesn't do that, we're doing just fine. For example, if white goes knight f3, intending a London, then we go d6, intending bishop g4 and e5, with a great game in response to bishop f4. For example, d6, bishop f4, bishop g4, intending a fast d5, and again, we've got a great game, and if white isn't careful, he can even get checkmated on d1 in these lines. And I guess anything else that white can do on move one, as usual, you know, c4, knight f3, knight f3, g3, b3, whatever it is, e3, d3, we're just going knight c6 again, intending a very fast d5 or e5, or maybe even knight c6, then d6, e5, or even e6, d5. No matter what, black's doing something in the center, and he's having a great game. So, No matter what, black just counterattacks in the center with those pawns on e7 and d7 and is getting a great game. So this concludes our analysis of the Nimzowitsch opening, proving once and for all, this really is the only opening you need as black if you want to absolutely crush your opponents. I'm telling you, if you want to reach 1500 ELO as fast as possible, learning one simple opening like this, like one knight c6 as black, could be the ticket you need to accelerate your progress. I mean, there's nothing worse than memorizing a bunch of long, complicated lines that don't even help you, when you can just go one knight c6 like this and get a great game as black, as I just showed you in this video. All right, that is all for today. If you enjoyed this video, please do me a huge favor. Smash that like button, subscribe to the channel, and comment down below in terms of what your favorite trick or trap from this video was. And comment down below what you think about one knight c6 being the only opening you need to play as black to get a great game out of the opening. Now, I've got a lot more great videos just like this coming up for you, so stick around for those, and I'll see you in the next video.